It starts in a parking garage beneath an office building in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a Tuesday morning in October with a plastic stick in my hand, and a future I had not planned for suddenly pressing against my ribs like something trying to be born. My name is Claire. I am 31 years old, and I am a senior financial analyst at a mid-size investment group, and I understand numbers the way some people understand music. I hear patterns in chaos. I see risk before it shows its face. My manager used to joke that I had a sixth sense for when something was about to go wrong, and he was not wrong about that. I just did not apply that instinct to my personal life quickly enough. I sat in that parking garage for 22 minutes. I counted every single one of them. I did not cry because I have never been a person who cries when I am in shock. I go very still instead. I go quiet, and I think and I calculate, and I figure out what the situation actually is before I let myself feel anything about it. That is not bravery. That is training. I was raised by a father who believed that emotion was a luxury you earned after the problem was solved, and a mother who taught me that the best way to survive something unbearable was to become the calmest person in the room. My father was an accountant in a small town outside of Asheville, and he worked with numbers the way a carpenter works with wood, precisely and without decoration. He did not talk about his feelings. He talked about interest rates and tax brackets and the importance of keeping receipts. When I was 12 years old and my grandfather died, my father sat me down and explained to me in very practical terms what a death certificate was, and why it mattered, and how the estate would be handled. And I remember thinking even then that he was not being cold. He was being useful because usefulness was the only language he spoke when the world got too big. My mother was different. She was a school librarian who read constantly and who understood people in a way my father never did, but she had learned over the years to match his rhythm. She would cry in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching, and then she would wash her face and put on her reading glasses and go back to her books like nothing had happened. I learned from both of them. I learned to feel things deeply, but to process them privately. I learned that the person who shows the least in a room full of people who are panicking is the person who is actually in control. I learned that stillness is not the absence of emotion. It is the decision to hold it somewhere it cannot be used against you. Those lessons served me well in my career. They did not serve me as well in my personal life. By the time I walked into the elevator that Tuesday morning, I had already decided I was keeping the baby. I want to tell you about Richard because you need to understand who he was before you can understand what he did, and why it mattered so much that someone finally said no to him. I met him at a company conference in Raleigh. It was a Thursday evening in February, and the conference was being held at a hotel downtown that was too fancy for its own good, with chandeliers that looked like they were trying to impress you and carpet that was so thick your shoes disappeared into it. I was standing near the bar with a glass of wine. I was not really drinking because I have never been much of a drinker, and I was watching the room the way I always watch rooms. Quietly, from the edges, noticing things. The way the junior analysts laughed too loudly at the senior partners' jokes. The way the administrative staff moved through the crowd like ghosts. The way power arranged itself physically in a room with the most important people always in the center and everyone else orbiting around them. Richard was in the center. That was the first thing I noticed about him. Not his face or his suit or his watch, though all of those were carefully chosen. It was where he was standing. Dead center of the room, with people arranged around him in a loose constellation of attention and admiration, and he held that position the way someone holds a throne. Not defensively, not arrogantly, naturally, like he had been born there and had never considered standing anywhere else. He was 53 years old, and confident in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be confident, which is to say, it was not really confidence at all, it was the absence of any reason to doubt himself. He was the principal founder of the firm I worked for, though he had stepped back from day-to-day operations and handed most of the actual work to a management team. He came into the office maybe twice a month. He traveled a lot. He collected things the way some people collect stamps, except his stamps were art and property and boats and opinions. He had a house in Asheville and a condo in Charleston, and a boat that I would later learn was docked at a marina near Wrightsville Beach, and an apartment in New York that he kept for when he had meetings there, which was apparently often enough to justify the expense. He was charming when he wanted to be. Not charming in a way that felt practiced, though I am sure it was. Charming in a way that felt like warmth, like attention, like you were the only person in the room who mattered and he had chosen you out of everyone to talk to, and that choice meant something. I want to be honest with you because this story only means something if I am honest. I was not naive. I was 30 years old and I knew exactly what a man like Richard was and was not offering. He was not offering commitment. He was not offering a future. He was not offering to meet my family or remember my birthday or hold my hand in public. He was offering the version of himself that existed in hotel bars and restaurant reservations and the back seat of town cars and late-night phone calls that were never about anything real. I understood that bargain completely. I had made similar bargains before, not with men like Richard, because I had never been in the orbit of a man like Richard before, but with men who offered just enough to make you feel seen and not enough to make you feel safe. I knew what that looked like. I knew what it cost. What I did not know, what I genuinely did not calculate, because I was apparently capable of being blind when it mattered most, was what it would cost me when I became inconvenient to him. We were together in whatever loose and unspoken way that word applies for about 8 months. He never introduced me to his family. I told myself that was fine because we were not serious. He told me his divorce from his second wife had been finalized the previous year. I did not ask to see the paperwork. I should have. I should have done a lot of things differently, but I did not, and I have to live inside that truth every single day, so I do not need anyone else to remind me of it. I should have asked about the divorce. I should have asked why a man who had been married twice and was 53 years old and had grown children was interested in a 30-year-old analyst at his firm. I should have asked why he only ever saw me at my apartment or his house or restaurants in other parts of the city where no one from the office would recognize us. I should have asked why his phone was always face down on the table. I should have asked a lot of things. But I did not ask them because I was 30 years old and I thought I was old enough to know what I was getting into, and because asking those questions would have required me to admit that I did not actually know what I was getting into, and that admission felt like weakness, and I had been taught my entire life that weakness was something you did not show. So I did not ask. I just proceeded. I went to his house on weekends. I sat across from him at dinners, where he ordered for me without asking what I wanted, and I let him because it felt easier than explaining that I had my own preferences. I listened to him talk about his business and his travels and his collections, and I nodded in the right places and laughed at the right moments, and I told myself that this was fine because I was not expecting anything more. And I was not. That is the truth. I was not expecting him to fall in love with me. I was not expecting him to leave his life and marry me and move me into his gated neighborhood with the 2 perfect lawns. I was expecting exactly what I got, which was 8 months of a man who was pleasant and charming and absent, and who treated me like a very nice interruption in a life that was already full. I was fine with that, until I was not fine with that anymore. Until the Tuesday morning in October when I sat in a parking garage and realized that the interruption had become the main event. That Tuesday morning in October when I found out I was pregnant, I drove to his house that evening. His house was a renovated colonial in a gated neighborhood outside the city, the kind of place where the lawns are too perfect and the silence feels purchased, and every house looks like it was designed by the same person who was terrified of anything that might look like individuality. I had been there maybe a dozen times before, and every time I pulled up to the gate, I felt like I was entering a space that was not meant for me. Not because anyone said so, because the air itself felt different there. Heavier, more controlled, like even the wind had to ask permission before it blew through those trees. I sat across from him at his kitchen island on a stool that probably cost more than my first car, and I told him directly. I was not asking for anything. I was informing him. I thought he deserved to know. I want you to really hear what I am about to say because this is the part that matters more than anything else in this entire story. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear the refrigerator running. I could hear the ice maker cycling. I could hear a dog barking somewhere outside in that perfect, quiet neighborhood, and the sound felt wrong there, like even the dogs were not supposed to make noise. Then he said, "That is not a good situation, Claire. Not, are you okay? Not, what do you need? Not, how are you feeling?" Not even a real response that acknowledged I was a human being sitting in front of him carrying a child we had created together. Just a careful, measured assessment, the way you would describe a bad quarter. That is not a good situation, Claire. As if I had reported an earnings shortfall. As if I had brought him a spreadsheet with an unfavorable variance. As if the thing growing inside me was a line item that did not belong in his budget. I said I know. He said we should talk about options. I said I have considered them and I am keeping it. He nodded slowly like he was processing data, and then he poured himself a glass of water and said he needed some time to think, and I drove home, and that was the last real conversation we ever had. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 8 months. 8 months of whatever that was, and the last real conversation we ever had was a man pouring himself a glass of water and telling me he needed time to think about the fact that I was carrying his child. He did not call the next day. He did not call the day after that. A week passed and my phone did not ring once with his name on the screen. I went to work. I sat in my office on the 4th floor of a building with his name on the lobby wall, and I looked at financial models, and I made recommendations, and I attended meetings, and I nodded when people spoke to me, and I ate lunch at my desk, and I drove home and I sat in my apartment, and I did not cry because I was still in the part where I go very still and very quiet and I calculate. I started researching family law attorneys in my spare time. Not because I was planning anything yet, but because I believe in knowing the terrain before you need to navigate it. That sixth sense again. The one that was apparently only good for other people's money and not my own life. I researched for 3 days. I read everything I could find about paternity law in North Carolina. I read about child support calculations. I read about the rights of unmarried parents. I read about one-party consent recording laws, because even then, even before anyone had called me or offered me anything or tried to make me go away, some part of me that I could not fully explain knew that I was going to need evidence of something. I could not tell you what that something was. I could not have articulated it. But I knew. The same way I knew when a portfolio was carrying risk that did not show up in the numbers. The same way I knew when a client was not telling me everything. I knew that something was coming and I needed to be ready for it. His mother called me on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my kitchen making pasta because cooking was the thing I did when I needed to think. Not fancy cooking, just basic pasta with whatever was in the refrigerator. The act of chopping and stirring and watching something transform from raw ingredients into something you could eat calmed me in a way that nothing else did. It was tangible. It was real. It was something I could control. The phone rang, and I saw a number I did not recognize, and I almost did not answer because I was tired and the pasta needed attention and I did not want to talk to a stranger. But I answered. I wish I could tell you why. I wish I could say that something warned me or that I felt it in my bones or that the air changed. But the truth is I just answered the phone because that is what I do. I answer the phone. I show up. I deal with what is on the other end. His mother, I will call her Margaret, because I have decided clarity matters more than discretion at this point, was 71 years old, and had the voice of a woman who had spent decades being obeyed. It was polished and deliberate, and every word was chosen with the precision of a surgeon selecting an instrument. It was the kind of politeness that is actually a form of aggression. The kind that does not need to raise its voice because it knows it will be heard. The kind that does not need to threaten because the threat is embedded in the tone itself like a blade inside a velvet sheath. She said she understood I was in a delicate situation. She said she wanted to help. Then she told me that her family was prepared to offer me $1.8 million. I remember exactly where I was standing. In my kitchen. Leftover pasta on the stove, though by that point it was not really leftover because I had not finished making it. The water was still in the pot. The noodles were sitting in a colander in the sink. The sauce was half assembled on the cutting board with a knife lying next to it, where I had set it down when the phone rang. My phone slightly warm against my ear, the evening light coming through the window above the sink at an angle that made the dust particles look like they were suspended in something thicker than air. I could smell the garlic I had been chopping. I could hear the water settling in the pipes. I could feel the cool tile under my bare feet. And a woman I had never met was offering me $1.8 million to pretend that my child did not deserve to know who his father was. I said, in exchange for what? She said a clean separation. She said they would handle everything, medical costs, relocation assistance if I preferred a fresh start somewhere new. There would be an agreement, of course. Standard language, confidentiality, non-disparagement. I would waive any claims against Richard or the family. I said, "You mean I would give up my child's right to know who their father is?" There was a pause, not a startled pause, not an uncomfortable pause, a calculated pause. The kind of pause that lets you know the person on the other end has already anticipated your objection and has a prepared response waiting for it. The kind of pause that tells you this is not the first time they have had this conversation, and it will not be the last. She said we prefer to think of it as protecting everyone's interests. I said, "Whose interests specifically?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. I could hear her breathing, or maybe I could hear the room she was in, which I imagined was large and tasteful and filled with things that cost more than most people's houses. Paintings that were chosen not because they were loved, but because they were valuable. Furniture that was selected not for comfort, but for impression. A room that said nothing about the person who lived in it, except that they could afford to say nothing. She said Claire, and my name in her mouth sounded like a problem to be solved. She said Richard has a great deal at stake right now. He is in the middle of a significant transaction. There are investors involved, partners, people whose confidence in him depends on a certain stability. A situation like this at this moment would be very disruptive. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because I recognized in that moment exactly what I was to this woman. I was a liability line on a spreadsheet. I was a risk to be mitigated. I was a number that could be made to go away with the application of sufficient funds and the right legal language. She did not see me as a person. She did not see my child as a person. She saw a problem, and she had been authorized to apply a solution, and the solution had a dollar amount attached to it, and that dollar amount was 1.8 million, and she genuinely could not understand why I would not just take it, because in her world everything had a price. And if you found someone who would not take the price, that was not a moral stand, that was a negotiating error. I said, "I understand." She sounded relieved. She said, "So you will consider." I said, "I understand what you are asking. I will be in touch." And I hung up the phone, and I stood in my kitchen for a very long time looking at the half-made pasta on the stove, and the knife on the cutting board, and the garlic that was starting to brown where it had been sitting. And I thought about what it meant that a woman I had never met had just tried to purchase the erasure of my unborn child. Then I went to my laptop, and I opened the folder I had already quietly started building, and I added the date and the time and a summary of the conversation because I had recorded the entire thing. Every word, every pause, every calculated breath, every instance of that polished aggression that she probably did not even realize she was performing, because she had been performing it for so long that it had become indistinguishable from her actual voice. North Carolina is a one-party consent state. I had looked that up 6 days earlier, not because I knew Margaret was going to call, because my sixth sense had told me something was coming, and I have learned over the course of my life and my career that when that feeling arrives, you do not argue with it. You prepare for it. I had downloaded a simple recording app on my phone. I had tested it to make sure it worked. I had kept it running in my pocket during meetings and phone calls for a week, just to get comfortable with the idea that everything I was saying and everything being said to me was being captured. I am not going to pretend that was normal behavior. It was not. It was the behavior of someone who had been trained to see risk everywhere and who had finally turned that lens on her own life. But it worked. The recording was clear. Every word was audible. There was no ambiguity about what was said and what was offered and what was being asked of me. It was not entrapment. It was documentation. There is a difference, and that difference is the entire reason this story has the ending it does. I called Margaret Ellison, my attorney, the next morning. Not related to Richard's family, just a coincidence of names that I have always found quietly satisfying, like the universe was offering me a small joke in the middle of something that was not funny at all. I found her the way I find most things, through research, through careful evaluation, through reading reviews and case histories and looking for patterns the same way I would evaluate any investment. I did not want the most expensive attorney in Charlotte. I did not want the most famous. I wanted the most precise, the one who did not make promises, the one who asked questions before she gave answers, the one who listened more than she spoke. Margaret had been practicing family law in Charlotte for 19 years. She was small and precise and absolutely ruthless in the way that the best attorneys are the ones who never raise their voice because they never need to. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that did not look like much from the outside, but inside it was immaculate and quiet, and every surface was exactly where it was supposed to be. No clutter, No unnecessary decoration. Just clean lines and good light, and the sense that everything in that space had been considered, and nothing had been included by accident. She had gray hair that she wore short and reading glasses that she wore low on her nose, and she looked at me the way my father used to look at a spreadsheet. Not with warmth, with attention, with the kind of focused patience that tells you the person across from you is not going to miss anything. I sat in a leather chair across from her desk, and I laid out everything. The relationship, the timeline, the pregnancy, the phone call. I did not cry, I did not get emotional. I told her the facts the way I would tell them to a colleague, chronologically, clearly, without decoration. Then I played her the recording. The room was very quiet while it played. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of traffic from the street below and Margaret's breathing, which was slow and measured and did not change at any point during the playback. When it finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk, and she looked at me, and she said, "Did they contact you again after this call?" I said, "Not yet." She said, "They will. And when they do, you are going to tell them you need more time to consider." I said, "Okay." She said, "Because by the time they call again, we will already be filed." I want to pause here because I know what some of you might be thinking. You might be thinking that $1.8 million is a lot of money. You might be thinking that I should have taken it. You might be thinking that I was being stubborn or idealistic or impractical, or that I did not understand what kind of security that kind of money could provide for a single mother. And I want to be honest with you about something. I thought about it. I sat with it for about 4 hours on that Thursday night, after I left Margaret's office, after I went home. After I finished making the pasta that I had abandoned when the phone rang and ate it cold standing over the sink because I was too tired to sit down. I sat on my couch in the dark and I thought about it. I genuinely weighed it. I ran the numbers in my head the way I would run any financial projection. I thought about what that money could buy. A house, security, a college fund, a life without worrying about anything material ever again. I thought about the fact that I grew up in a house where money was always tight and my father worked 2 jobs and my mother wore the same coat for 6 years, and I knew what it felt like to be a child in a family where there was not enough. I thought about all of that. I sat with it honestly and completely and without flinching. But here is what I kept coming back to. That money was not for me or my child. It was for them. It was to make their problem disappear. It was hush money dressed up in the language of compassion and assistance and concern. And the moment I signed that agreement, I would be agreeing that my child was a problem. That my child's existence was something Richard could pay to erase from his life. That paternity, legal documented real paternity, was optional for wealthy men. That the rules that applied to everyone else did not apply to people like them, because they could afford to make the rules go away. I thought about what it would mean to look at my child someday and know that I had sold their truth, that I had taken a check and in exchange I had agreed to pretend that they did not have a father, that I had let a woman with monogrammed stationery and a voice like polished glass decide what my child was worth and I had accepted her valuation. I could not do it, not for $1.8 million, not for 5, not for 10, because the price was not money. The price was my child's truth, and that was not mine to sell. Margaret filed the paternity petition and the child support claim on a Friday morning. She moved fast. We filed first before Richard's family had time to get their own attorneys moving before they could seek any kind of protective order before they could build a wall around him. I was not filing for revenge. I want to be clear about that. I was filing because my child deserved a father on record. Deserved financial support that reflected the actual reality of who they were. Deserved to exist in the light instead of in some negotiated shadow. That afternoon, a licensed process server walked into the lobby of Richard's office building. I thought about his assistant when I heard that. Young woman, maybe 25. Always polite when I came to visit. Always smiling. Always had a cup of coffee ready before I asked for it. I wondered if she knew. I wondered if anyone in that office knew. I hoped she was not the one who had to take the envelope to him. I hoped he got it handed to him directly in front of someone whose opinion he cared about, because Richard was the kind of man who cared very much about opinions. He cared about how things looked. He cared about the narrative. And having a process server walk into his building and hand him a paternity petition was not the narrative he had been planning. His attorney called Margaret within 2 hours. She told me about it that evening. Apparently the call was not particularly cordial. She said he is claiming the relationship was casual and that paternity is disputed. He will request a DNA test. I said we will welcome one. She said we already have. And here is something interesting. In North Carolina, courts can order prenatal paternity testing. We are going to request it. I want this established before the baby arrives. I did not know that was possible. I had assumed we would have to wait until after the birth. The look on my face must have said something because Margaret gave a small, satisfied nod and said they assumed you did not know that either. That was the thing about Richard and his family and his attorneys. They assumed. They assumed I would take the money. They assumed I would not record the call. They assumed I would not know about prenatal testing. They assumed I would not have a forensic accountant. They assumed I would not file first. They assumed so many things about me, and every single assumption was wrong because they were assuming about a woman they had never actually seen. They were assuming about the version of me they had invented in their heads. The version that could be bought. The version that would go away quietly. The version that did not exist. Over the next 6 weeks, Richard's legal team tried several things. First, they filed a motion arguing that the relationship had been mutually casual and without reasonable expectation of commitment, as if that had anything to do with child support law. It did not. The court was not interested in whether our relationship had been serious. The court was interested in biology and responsibility. Those were the only 2 words that mattered. Biology and responsibility. Everything else was noise. Their motion was procedural nonsense dressed up in legal language, and Margaret dismantled it in a response that was 3 pages long and did not waste a single word. Then they tried to argue that I had been aware of Richard's complicated personal circumstances and had proceeded knowingly implying without quite saying it that I had somehow engineered the pregnancy, that I had done this on purpose, that I had seen an opportunity and taken it, that I was not a person who had found herself in a difficult situation, but a strategist who had created one. Margaret submitted financial records and communications and a timeline to the court that made that argument difficult to maintain with a straight face, because the truth was in the data. The truth was in the text messages and the calendar entries and the pattern of our interactions, which showed clearly and without ambiguity that this was not a plan. This was a life, my life, a life that had taken a turn I had not anticipated and that I was now navigating the best way I knew how. Then they sent a second offer through official channels. $2.4 million this time. An increase of $600,000, like they were negotiating a real estate transaction and I was the property they were trying to acquire. Not a person, a property, a line item, a problem with a revised price tag. Margaret forwarded it to me with a single line. Your call. I declined. The prenatal DNA test came back in early December. 99.9%. I sat in my car again just like I had in October, and this time I let myself feel something. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something quieter than that. A door closing. A fact becoming permanent. A small person inside me who now had a name on paper and a legal claim and could not be erased by anyone, no matter how much money they had or how many attorneys they employed or how carefully they chose their words over the phone. I put my hand on my stomach, and I sat there in the parking lot of a grocery store where I had gone to buy orange juice, and I thought about the fact that the child inside me was now a fact in the eyes of the law, and no amount of money or power or influence could change that fact, and I felt something that I can only describe as the emotional equivalent of a lock turning. Not locking someone out, locking something in. Locking my child's place in the world into something that could not be opened by anyone who did not have the key, and the key was not money, it was the law. Richard's attorney filed no further challenges to paternity. What came next was the part I had not fully anticipated, even though Margaret had tried to prepare me for it. In high-income cases, child support in North Carolina is not calculated the same way it is for average earners. There are guidelines, but judges have discretion when income exceeds the standard worksheet. Richard's disclosed income, and I want to emphasize the word disclosed, because what he disclosed and what Margaret and her forensic accountant found were 2 meaningfully different numbers, was substantial. Margaret had hired a forensic accountant named David who was quiet and meticulous, and who looked at financial documents the way a radiologist looks at rays. He saw things that other people missed. He saw patterns. He saw gaps. He saw numbers that did not quite add up, and he followed them until they did. What he found was that Richard's initial financial declaration had included his salary from the investment firm and his declared earnings from the real estate holding company, but it had not included a series of private equity stakes that were held in a separate entity that was not immediately connected to his name on paper, but was connected through a chain of ownership that David was able to trace with the patience of a man who genuinely enjoyed this kind of work. The total picture was significantly more than what had appeared in his initial financial declaration. Margaret told me during one of our sessions that child support in cases like this is not symbolic. It is meant to ensure the child maintains a standard of living commensurate with the paying parent's means. I remember thinking about those words. Commensurate with. I work with words like that every day. I build models around concepts like that. But hearing them applied to my child by an attorney in a small, immaculate office on a Thursday afternoon was different. It made it real in a way that the pregnancy tests and the phone calls and the legal filings had not. My child was going to have a legal claim to Richard's life, not to his presence, not to his love, not to any of the things that actually matter to a child who wants to know their father, but to a portion of the world he had built. And that portion was going to be enforced by the state. I remember thinking about Margaret's words, and then thinking about Richard's mother, not my attorney, but the other Margaret, and her careful description of Richard's situation. The transaction, the investors, the stability. She had miscalculated something important. She had treated this like a negotiation between equals where the most powerful party wins. She had forgotten or never learned that in a courtroom power is redistributed. A woman with documentation and a good attorney and a legally recognized claim can walk through the same doors as anyone else. The hearing was in February. I was 7 months pregnant by then. I wore a navy blazer I had owned since before any of this started because I did not want to buy something new for the occasion. I wanted to be exactly who I was before they tried to make me smaller. I wanted Richard and his mother and his attorneys and the judge and everyone in that room to see that I had not dressed up for this. I had not performed for this. I had simply shown up as myself, and that was enough. I remember getting ready that morning. I stood in my bathroom, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and I saw a woman who was 7 months pregnant, and who had not slept well the night before, and who had dark circles under her eyes, and whose hair would not do what she wanted it to do, and who had to stop twice on the way to the courthouse, because the baby was pressing on her bladder. And I thought about Richard's mother in her pearls and her monogrammed stationery, and I wondered if she had ever had a morning like this. A morning where her body was not her own, where she could not control how she looked or how she felt or what her face was doing. I doubted it. I doubted that woman had ever not been in control of anything. The courthouse was a building I had driven past 100 times but never entered. It was made of stone, and it had columns at the entrance that were supposed to look impressive, but just looked heavy, and the floors inside were marble, and the lighting was fluorescent, and everything echoed. I walked through the metal detector, and I set my bag on the conveyor belt, and I watched it go through the machine, and I thought about the fact that the recording on my phone had gone through this same machine 6 months ago. When I went to Margaret's office for the first time, and here, I was on the other end of a process that had started with a woman's voice on a phone, and a glass of water being poured, and a word that sounded like a problem being solved. Richard was there. I had not seen him in 4 months. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe I just saw him differently now. Maybe the charm had worn off, and what was left was just a man in an expensive suit who had tried to pay for his child to not exist. He sat next to his attorney, and he did not look at me once. Not when I walked in. Not when I sat down. Not when Margaret began speaking. He stared straight ahead like I was a column in his field of vision that he had trained himself not to see. His attorney was a tall man with gray temples and a voice that carried, and he spoke the way attorneys speak when they are paid a lot of money to make uncomfortable things sound reasonable. His mother was in the gallery. She looked at me the entire time. I could feel her eyes on the back of my neck like a hand pressing between my shoulder blades. She was wearing pearls and a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and she looked at me the way you look at something that has gone wrong. Not with anger. With disappointment, like I had failed to fulfill my function, like I was a machine that was supposed to produce one outcome and had produced another. I did not turn around. I did not acknowledge her. I sat in my navy blazer with my hands folded in my lap, and I let Margaret do what Margaret did. Margaret presented our case methodically. The forensic accountant had done thorough work. Richard had income from multiple sources: the investment firm, a real estate holding company, a series of private equity stakes that had not been initially disclosed. The total picture was significantly more than what had appeared in his initial financial declaration. She walked the court through each source of income. She explained the ownership structure of the private equity entity. She showed the connections that Richard had not disclosed. She did all of this without raising her voice, without rushing, without any theatricality, just facts, just numbers. Just the quiet logic underneath someone else's carefully constructed chaos. His attorney objected to several of the exhibits. The judge reviewed them. The objections were overruled. At one point, Richard's attorney tried to argue that certain income streams were irregular and non-recurring and therefore should not factor into the calculation. He stood up and he buttoned his jacket the way men do when they are about to say something they think is important, and he spoke at length about the nature of private equity distributions and how they were not guaranteed and how they could not be predicted and how including them in a child support calculation was fundamentally unfair. The judge looked at him over her glasses. She said counsel irregular does not mean invisible. The courtroom was quiet for a moment after that, not a dramatic quiet. Just the kind of quiet that happens when someone says something that everyone in the room knows is true but no one expected to hear out loud. I kept my face still. I had learned that from Margaret. Reactions are for outside the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, you are a vessel for evidence and nothing else. The judge did not rule from the bench that day. She took it under advisement and issued her order 11 days later. I was sitting on my couch when Margaret called. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Daniel was moving inside me the way he always did in the late afternoon, like he was rearranging furniture in there. And I was drinking tea and half watching something on television that I was not really paying attention to. My phone rang and I saw Margaret's name and I picked it up, and she said Claire and I said yes, and she said the order came through, and I said okay, and she read me the number. I put the phone down on the cushion next to me, and I sat there for a long time. I sat there until the tea got cold, and the thing on television ended, and another thing started, and Daniel stopped moving, and the afternoon light shifted from gold to gray. And I sat there, and I thought about the fact that a judge in a courthouse in Charlotte, North Carolina had looked at the evidence and had decided that my child was real, and that his father's money was real, and that the two things were connected in a way that could not be undone. It was not about the amount. I want to say that again clearly because I think it is important, and because I think sometimes people hear these stories and they assume the woman was after money from the beginning. I had a job. I had savings. I had built a life that was mine. The amount mattered because it was fair, because the court looked at what Richard actually earned and decided that his child deserved a portion of that. The same portion any child in the state would be entitled to. He could not negotiate that away. He could not pay someone to not enforce it. The state does not work that way. Margaret called me again 2 hours later. She had heard from his attorney. Richard wanted to discuss a global settlement, a lump sum payment in exchange for modifying the ongoing support structure. She asked, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want the order enforced exactly as written." 3 days after Daniel was born, 7 pounds 2 ounces, 20 inches long, with Richard's exact jawline, and my eyes, a copy of the court order was filed with the state's Child Support Enforcement Division. It was now a matter of public record. Richard Ashford, founder of Ashford Capital Group, was the legal father of my son and was ordered to pay monthly support accordingly. I want to tell you about the moment Daniel was born because I think it matters. I think the specifics of it matter. I was in the hospital room and it was 3 a.m, and the lights were low, and the nurse was standing next to me, and my sister was holding my hand, and I remember the physical sensation of it, which I will not describe in detail, because that is not what this story is about, but I will say that there was a moment right at the end where everything went quiet, and then there was a sound that I had never heard before, and it was the sound of my child breathing, and it was the most ordinary sound in the world. And also the most extraordinary, and I looked at him, and he had Richard's jawline and my eyes, and he was the most real thing I had ever seen. And I thought about the woman on the phone who had offered me money to make him go away, and I thought about how she had never seen him, and she had never heard that sound, and she had never held him, and she had decided anyway that he was worth less than the price of a transaction, and I felt something in that moment that I still cannot fully name. It was not anger. It was not triumph. It was something more fundamental than either of those things. It was the feeling of looking at your child and knowing that you made the right decision, not the easy decision, not the convenient decision, not the decision that would have made everyone else comfortable. The right decision. I heard through someone at the firm that when the news made its way through the company, the conference room went very quiet. The investors he had been so worried about, several of them had daughters. A few had wives who had navigated similar situations in their own ways. Apparently what they found troubling was not the existence of a child. It was the behavior that had preceded the court case. The offer, the recording, the calculated attempt to make a human being disappear for a price. I do not know what happened in those rooms. I was not there. But the transaction his mother had been so worried about protecting was delayed 6 months. His mother sent me a letter. No attorney letterhead. Personal stationery. Cream-colored, monogrammed. She wrote that she hoped we could find a way to move forward with grace. I did not respond, not because I was angry. I had moved past angry a long time ago, but because I did not owe her my grace. I did not owe her anything. What I owed was to Daniel, to the child who did not ask to be born into a complicated situation, who had done nothing except exist, and whose existence had been treated like a problem to be managed by people who had never once stopped to think about what he deserved. He deserved a mother who did not take the money. He deserved a mother who walked into a courthouse instead of signing an agreement and said clearly and on record that he was real and he mattered and no amount of money was going to make that less true. I went back to work when Daniel was 4 months old. Different firm, better title, better salary. I had spent the months of my leave thinking carefully about what I wanted the next chapter to look like, and it looked like this. Independent, documented, mine. I was not going back to a building with Richard's name on it. I was not going to sit in meetings where people knew about the case and looked at me with something in their eyes that I could not name. I was going to build something new, and I was going to build it on my own terms, and I was going to do it while raising a child who was going to know from the moment he was old enough to understand that his mother did not compromise on him. Not for anyone. Not for any amount. Richard has never held his son. He has never asked to. I will not pretend that does not carry a weight I am still learning to set down. There are nights when Daniel is crying, and I am walking him around the apartment in the dark, and I think about the fact that there is another person in the world who could be holding him right now. Another person who is his father, who shares his blood and his jawline, and whatever other pieces of DNA got passed down in that quiet, invisible way that biology works. And that person has never once asked to see him, has never once called to ask how he is doing, has never once sent a birthday card or a gift or even a text message. That absence is not something I can fix. It is not something the court can fix. The court can enforce financial support. It cannot enforce presence. It cannot enforce love. It cannot enforce the kind of fatherhood that actually matters, which is the kind where you show up. Daniel will ask about him someday. I have already thought about what I will say. I will tell him the truth in the way a child can hear it. And I will let him form his own conclusions when he is ready. What I will not do is tell him his father tried to pay for him to not exist. He does not need to carry that. That part is mine. There are things people do not tell you about going through something like this. They do not tell you how tired you will be, not emotionally though, that too. Physically. How much energy it takes to keep showing up to appointments and hearings and depositions when you are also growing a human being and doing your job and pretending to the world that you are fine. There were days during those 8 months when I would leave a meeting with Margaret and drive to my office and sit in the parking lot for 10 minutes just to gather enough energy to walk inside. There were nights when I would lie in bed and stare at the ceiling and think about the fact that I was one person fighting a machine that had been built over decades by people who had more money and more connections and more experience than I would ever have. There were moments when I felt so small that I could practically feel myself shrinking. When the gap between what I was trying to do and what I was up against felt so vast that it made my chest hurt just to think about it. They do not tell you how lonely it gets. Not because you do not have people who love you. I have my sister. I have friends who showed up in ways I did not expect. My sister came to every hearing. She sat next to me in the car beforehand, and she did not say much because she knows that I do not need words when I am preparing. She just sat there. She just was there. That meant more than she will ever know. but because the specific loneliness of making a decision that everyone else has an opinion about is something you carry alone. People had opinions about the fact that I took it to court. People had opinions about why I had not just taken the money. People had opinions about whether I had been foolish to get involved with Richard in the first place. People had opinions about whether I was doing this for the right reasons or the wrong reasons. People had opinions about whether I should have told my parents. People had opinions about whether I should have told my coworkers. People had opinions about everything, and most of those opinions were offered by people who had never been in a situation even remotely like mine, and who had the luxury of having opinions because they were not the ones who had to live inside the consequences of them. I stopped listening to most of those opinions around month 3, not because I was dismissive, because I did not have the energy. I was using every ounce of energy I had on staying upright and moving forward and building a case and growing a child and keeping my job and not falling apart, and I did not have anything left for other people's opinions about choices they did not have to make. Here is what I know on the other side of it. The law was not designed to favor me. It was not designed to favor women in my position or single mothers or people without resources. The law is imperfect and slow and frustrating, and it does not always produce the outcome you want, and there are people with more money and better attorneys who lose cases they should win every single day. I know that. I am not naive about that. But it was also not designed to favor him simply because he had more money than me. And when you find the right attorney and you document everything and you file first, and you file correctly, the law can be the most equalizing force in the room. Not the money. Not the connections. Not the mother with the monogrammed stationery. The law. I think about that sometimes when Daniel is asleep and the apartment is quiet. About how close I came to signing something. About how many women have signed something. Not because they wanted to, but because they were scared or exhausted, or they did not know they had options, or they simply did not have the 6 seconds of stubbornness it took me to say I will be in touch and hang up the phone. I think about those women, and I think about the fact that the only difference between me and them might have been timing, or luck, or the fact that I had spent my entire career being trained to see risk before it arrived, or the fact that my father taught me that stillness was power, or the fact that I happened to find an attorney named Margaret who happened to be ruthless in exactly the right way. I do not know what the difference was. I only know that there was one and that it could just as easily have gone the other way, and I do not take that for granted. Not for a single day. You do not have to be fearless. I was not fearless. I was terrified every single day of those 8 months. I was terrified when Margaret's phone rang and it was his attorney. I was terrified when I walked into the courthouse. I was terrified when the judge was reviewing the exhibits. I was terrified when the order came through because I was afraid it would not be what we asked for. I was terrified when Daniel was born because I was afraid that something would go wrong and that all of it would have been for nothing. I was terrified all the time, but being terrified and moving forward anyway, that is the whole thing. That is all it ever is. Daniel is 11 months old now. He is starting to pull himself up on the coffee table and look around the room with this expression of complete astonishment, like he cannot believe how much there is to see. He has 4 teeth, and he says mama, which is not really a word yet, but it sounds like one, and he laughs at things that are not funny, like the sound of a plastic cup being set down on a wooden table, and the way the curtain moves when the air conditioning comes on, and I watch him, and I think about the version of events where I took the money, where I relocated to somewhere new and raised him alone and gave him a story with a gap in it, a space where the truth should have been. I think about what that would have looked like. A nice apartment in a city where no one knew me, a bank account with a lot of zeros, a child who grew up without a name for his father, a woman who spent the rest of her life pretending she had not made a choice but had simply accepted one that was made for her. I am glad that is not the story we have. His story is that his mother went to court, that she stood in a room with marble floors and fluorescent lighting, and a judge who did not care how much money the other side had, and she said this child is real, and he is owed the truth, and no amount of money changes that. That is the story I will tell him when he is old enough. That is the story I am telling you now. If you have been in something like this, if someone has told you that your situation can be bought, that your silence has a price, that you are the kind of problem that money can make disappear, I want you to know something. Document everything. Find an attorney who believes in your case before you need one. Know your state's laws because they are probably different from what you assume. And understand that the moment you walk into a courthouse and file, you change the shape of what is possible. They are not more powerful than the law. They just want you to believe they are. Do not let them.